recently saw a TikTok which explained that you don't have to worry about calling demons into yourself with tarot because God, the devil, the heavens and the hells and the demons are all inside you already. They're all a part of you. She bases this on a Joseph Campbell quote. So she's clearly talking to beginners who are interested in tarot and witchcraft, but who are nervous because people have claimed this opens you up to evil spirits. I think there are better ways to address this idea or this concern. But I'm sure a lot of people will be comforted by the basic witch talk answer she gave, even though it really doesn't address their fears and probably doesn't reflect their beliefs. See, there is no firm reality behind what she's saying. It's a belief. In fact, in this case, it's really more of a reflective philosophical statement about how we relate to stories than it is Joseph Campbell expressing a real metaphysical belief. It's not addressing the idea of demons, the devil, God, heaven, or hell as real things so much as lenses through which we understand the world and ourselves. If you believe any of them are real, or believe gods or spirits are real, this statement isn't actually helpful except as a band-aid. But maybe all you need is a band-aid to make you feel like you have permission. That's kind of okay, especially when you're starting out. Sometimes you just need something to help you feel a little more comfortable when something makes you feel a little shaky. But you should still probably think about and engage with your own beliefs and ideas rather than just accepting random witch talk ramblings. So let's step it back a bit. This claim is being supported by looking at Joseph Campbell as a source of authority. The problem is, he isn't really a source of authority. And this witch talk content creator allegedly goes to a really good school, so she probably knows he isn't. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Again, she might just be trying to give people that band-aid to give them permission. So I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt and hope that's all it is. And that's also why I'm not talking about who the creator is, because this isn't an attack on someone. This is really jumping off from this idea and exploring what are some better ways we can think about this, better ways we can look at this, and how we cannot accept kind of the easiest low-hanging fruit when that easy low-hanging fruit is maybe not very good. So Campbell was a very popular theorist around mythology and folklore towards the end of the point where these fields were of study were modernizing. So the height of his popularity was probably around like the 70s and 80s. But even when I was getting started in witchcraft and magic in the 90s, you still saw a lot of people recommend Campbell. Uh, there was definitely a point where I thought Joseph Campbell was somebody that was like majorly important to study. But that period where I thought that was pretty short, like because even by the 90s, people were starting to understand that Campbell's ideas were not that solid. So decades prior to Campbell, and more or less ending just after Campbell, these fields of study started to move out of the range of hobbies and began to become more serious, formal fields of study. But they were heavily shaped by perennialist philosophy, which is the idea that there is an eternal truth behind everything, and all myths and religions and stories and ideas are partial reflections of that eternal truth. And along with this perennialist philosophy, the idea that myths were universal. And so this is the idea that across all cultures, all the same stories are being told. That there's basically a handful of core stories, and everyone is retelling these core stories. Um, Frequently, the myth of Jesus ends up being kind of the center that the interpretation is based on, because the people who held these ideas mostly were coming from a Christian context. And so you see all sorts of mythology being restructured around the idea of dying and resurrected gods in universalism. Campbell's had to do with the idea of there being a particular story arc that heroes go through as their tale is essentially a form of initiation and then a return to society after that initiation. These ideas leaned heavily into Jungian ideas, which were also shaped by that same perennialist philosophy and that same treatment of myths as universal. And these weren't things where like Jung invented this or like Campbell invented this. Early anthropologists, early folklorists, early forms of mythological studies, they all had this concept. This was a thing that was fairly popular around the end of the 19th century and through much of the 20th century. But the thing is, perennialism and universalism were more belief systems than actual academic ideas with a basis in actual evidence. And those who wrote from a perennialist and universalist perspective often actively and aggressively bent evidence and selectively curated evidence to fit these beliefs. So, like, they'd look at myths that they felt fit their angle or fit their idea and then ignore ones that didn't. Or they would take versions of myths that fit their idea and ignore ones that didn't. Or if a myth seemed important and seemed good and maybe almost close to what they were saying, they might bend how they told it, bend how they explained it, insert interpretations that aren't actually based on anything supported in order to try to show that the myth fit the basic pattern or the basic universal myth that they were trying to claim. And so this is the type of writer that Joseph Campbell was. Joseph Campbell fit into this tradition of exploring mythology and writing about mythology in this way. And that's something where these same issues with evidence show up in Joseph Campbell's writing. So today, Campbell's work is somewhat controversial. Like the academic standards and the way people think about evidence and think about proof behind an idea or a theory is much more rigorous than it was 100 years ago or 150 years ago. And that time between about the 1920s and the 1970s and 1980s was where that shift happened. And so you still had a lot of people who were taking those sort of old evidentiary models where you could just sort of have an idea and express that idea without really proving it, or where you could make the idea shape the evidence instead of the evidence shape the idea. And so Campbell, again, fit into that. Now, he's still a very popular author, particularly with a lot of amateur enthusiasts of mythology and psychology. His works make for a great map in writing fiction. In fact, Star Wars is largely based on Joseph Campbell, and a lot of people think that that is why Star Wars is so popular. That George Lucas studied a lot of Joseph Campbell's work, and that he modeled the story on the structure that Joseph Campbell laid out. Because Joseph Campbell's structure for the hero's journey really does speak to people. It does reflect things that at least modern people seem to need in kind of their understanding of how the average person can become the hero, go on an adventure, and then rejoin society. George Lucas isn't the only person to have been influenced by Campbell's thinking. And again, a lot of these ideas of universalism and perennialism were existing before Joseph Campbell, so even earlier 20th century fiction before Joseph Campbell reflects sort of like a proto version of the hero's journey. So there's a lot of fiction that you can analyze based on Joseph Campbell. So as a result, there's a lot of discussion as to whether or not his work should be used as educational material for writers and for literary analysis, uh, while more or less being abandoned as far as exploration of myth, religion, and history go. And personally, I tend to agree with that. I think that, yeah, using him as a tool for learning to write, using him as a tool for analyzing modern fiction, that's great. But a lot less useful as far as analyzing myth, religion, and history. There are still some people who want to hold on to it for those purposes. I think more people probably want to hold on to it because they think it has value in terms of exploring the history of ideas than actually informing us about the real study of myth. Uh, but the majority of people don't seem to accept him as authoritative in studying myth anymore. Like you might find some teachers, some programs where he's still used, but I don't think that that is broadly the case. Uh, Now, the particular quote from Campbell that this content creator used All the gods, all the heavens, and all the hells are within you. Nice enough quote. It reminds me of the Gospel of Thomas. So it's not like it's an idea that's entirely original to Campbell. And we'll talk about some other versions of this idea that were earlier than him. Based on other things this creator has posted, I'm not sure she actually believes this. It seems at odds with some other stuff that she said, but I can't say for sure. I don't know her personally, but I have noticed that kind of inconsistency is common to her content, though. But I don't think that's, again, I'm not trying to attack this creator. I don't think that's specific to her. I think anyone who is trying to post 5, 6 short videos a day, because that's what the algorithm makes you do, is going to end up having content that is not always consistent, or that they're kind of expressing something because it's easy to express that as a short form thing, but it doesn't allow them to actually get into the depth of their ideas, so things may look inconsistent, even when they have further explanations to explain that consistency. But the flip side of that is, like, we're being kind of generous there, assuming that that's the case. Looking for things like whether or not their explanations are consistent with one another, whether or not their ideas are consistent, is a good way to look at how to judge what we're listening to and who we're listening to. Are they making content to make content, or are they saying things that seem consistent with what they do and believe? Anyway, let's go back to the meat of this. So, whether or not the quote is something the content creator believes or not, it doesn't work as an appeal to authority. You can't determine from the study of mythology if it's all inside you. This isn't something that can be assessed from any academic exploration. So this is just Campbell expressing a philosophical reflection based on the influence of Jungian thought. As far as I know, Campbell was not a magician. Campbell wasn't a priest. Campbell wasn't a theologian or esotericist. He wasn't exploring and engaging either in a practical or philosophical way that would give him real insight to make this statement with any authority. And again, I don't think he's making this statement as a statement about reality. I think he's making this statement as a lens through which we look at stories and our relationship with stories. It's irrespective of whether or not the statement is true, the statement has to do with how we engage with stories that we hear, stories that we read. Now, again, he's not the only one to say things like that. In the early 20th century, Crowley described demons as being parts of your physical brain. This was part of Crowley's initiated explanation of ceremonial magic. I believe that's the name of it, or it's something close to that. It was an essay that he published along with his edition of the Goetia, which, for those unaware of it, was a early modern era magical text for conjuring demons. A lot of people think of it as a really important text. It's actually relatively unimportant. It's just one that was only ever written in English, and so it was easily available to members of the Golden Dawn during the occult revival of the late 19th, early 20th century. And so it was one of the few grimoires that was available through the bulk of the 20th century and continuously published. So it had a lot of influence in the 20th century, but prior to that, not super influential, not super important. Now, Crowley, in introducing the Goetia, at the time, he kind of took an opinion that it wasn't super important to understand whether or not the various phenomena of magic were real, as long as they had some effect. And so he theorized that the demons were physical parts of the brain, that you could divide the brain into 72 regions, and that by doing certain ritual activities and having the right signs and symbols and incense, that those cues were coded into you in such a way that it would activate a portion of your brain, and you would put yourself in a state where you could easily hallucinate, and that portion of the brain would become active and cause you to hallucinate the spirit and have the spirit interaction. And then by interacting with that spirit and interacting with that portion of your brain, You would restructure how you think and how you experience. And so, if you were always concerned about being sick, you would start understanding things to do to be healthier or seeing yourself as healthier. If you were poor, you would start seeing opportunities for wealth or seeing better ways to manage your money. In none of these did your world actually change. It was a matter of changing your perspectives and your way of thinking about things by kind of like poking and diddling with your brain through rituals where you hallucinated demons. That idea was freaking bonkers, and Crowley eventually rejected it. Most of his followers don't take that approach. They don't take the approach that uh, demons are physical parts of the brain. But a lot of them have ignored that he rejected the idea, and instead they've adopted a watered down approach to it in which they believe that demons are part of your psyche. And it kind of works the same way that you do the rituals and you interact with a portion of your psyche and then you reintegrate that portion of your psyche so that you are a more holistic and complete individual, and are then able to function more effectively. If that sounds familiar to you, that shouldn't be too surprising, even if you haven't studied Crowley, because again, a lot of modern magicians take that idea, but also it's probably where Scientology gets the idea of a bunch of dead alien souls being in you, and you have to like clear them and integrate in order to be a functional person. It's also probably the basis of some shadow work ideas. Uh, because if you aren't aware, shadow work is super new. It's based on Jung, which would have been within the range of ideas that were swirling around the same idea that Crowley was presenting. And but it's not really actually comprehending Jung's ideas. It's really more rooted in some ideas of some popular writers in the 1990s. And so this idea of breaking apart and reintegrating parts of yourself that have been rejected is the same core idea that happens there. So ideas like this are generally rooted in people who want to explore and do magic but are struggling to actually believe in it. At least when we talk about it from this like idea of conjuring demons or conjuring spirits, but they're really parts of your mind. When we talk about it in like the case of like these other systems like Scientology and Shadowwork, they're not trying to be magicians, although, well, sometimes. But they're trying to do things that like replace psychology. So if you want to be a magician but you don't believe in magic, the easiest answer is to redefine magic into something that isn't real and it's just a code word for spicy psychology. And that's kind of what this idea of it's all in you, it's all in your head does. The vast majority of people who are exploring historical modes of witchcraft and witchcraft inspired by folklore understand spirits to be real and autonomous. The vast majority of people exploring traditional grimoires, the books that teach us how to work with demons and angels, they understand spirits to be real and autonomous. Most traditional living spirit traditions outside of the Anglophone world approach spirits as real and autonomous. It's pretty consistent in most areas. It's only this sort of kind of modern cut off, incomplete approach that doesn't view spirits that way. The idea that it's all in you can work for philosophical reflection. It can work for looking at how myths or even fictional stories teach you lessons about your personality or how they become metaphors for struggles in life. It can help you explore some elements of your psyche potentially, but it's not a useful model for exploring, understanding, or explaining magic, and that includes things like divination and the use of tarot cards. Magic gets bigger and more effective when you put away childish things like the narcissistic and solipsistic view that it's all about you and it's all inside you. Get out of your own way and experience a bigger world. So, if we're going to take the approach that spirits are real, and that means that demons are real, does that mean demons are invited in by doing tarot and witchcraft? Well, let's first look at who's saying that. So that's the kind of thing that churches and pastors say. And they say that um, because they have more control over you and they make more money from you if you listen to them and you don't do things that give you spiritual or religious independence. They're better off if you don't do things that lead to you joining groups and receiving spiritual guidance and fellowship far away from them. And that's something where, even though like there are branches of Christianity and Christian institutions that I respect, uh, all of them have that as an impetus or a motive behind what they do when they say things like this. So whether we're talking about a crazy pastor in Texas burning books and calling for witch hunts, or we're talking about the Pope in the Vatican running the Roman Catholic Church, when they start putting out stuff that says that going to yoga class is going to fill you with demons, it's because they're worried going to yoga class is going to pull you away from them. Now, sometimes they might have an earnest feeling about the need to keep people in the flock because they really think of themselves as a shepherd, but somewhere, some part of that motivation is going to be the fact that for them to keep existing, for their institution to have money, for their institution to have control, they need to keep people involved. They need to keep butts in the seats. That is a even bigger thing when we're talking about less institutional forms of Christianity. So evangelical Christianity, independent churches, non denominational churches, mega churches where the pastors make tons of money. There's a huge amount of showmanship there, and there is a huge need for them to keep people in the seats and keep people coming in. And fear is a great way to do that. Even outside of religion, in salespeople are trained to sell fear. They sell you on what can go wrong and why you need the thing they're selling in order to avoid what would go wrong. They have a vested interest in shooting all these other things that might be attractive to you down if those things could potentially take you away from them. So take anything they say about things that you shouldn't be exploring with a grain of salt. For comparison's sake, look at a lot of things that are like obviously considered sinful in Christianity. They don't say that adultery is going to fill you with demons. They don't say that masturbating is going to fill you with demons. They don't say that lying is going to fill you with demons. Those are things that they know people will do, and then they can be forgiven for, uh, because those are things that don't take people away from the flock. They're things where you do that thing, and then you're like, oh, I'm sorry, and then you're still part of the group, and you're still paying your tithe. But if you get into witchcraft, paganism, tarot, alternative spirituality, the New Age, things like that, you might leave and not come back, and then you're not a source of revenue for them. The other issue is that these people don't have experience with the things they're attacking, so they speak from a place of ignorance. And not necessarily vile, hateful ignorance, although often they do, especially when we're talking about like those Texas pastors burning books, but actual ignorance in the sense of not knowing jack shit about what they're talking about. So maybe the grain of salt is generous, and we should just not listen to them at all. All right, so secondly, what's the basis for this idea that tarot brings in demons? Now, if we're talking tarot specifically, the church was originally against tarot because they thought it would encourage laziness and people ignoring responsibilities because they were playing games, and that it would lead to gambling, which could lead to other vices that could disrupt the smooth, cohesive nature of urban communities. This is something that's documented. There's actual writing from church leaders saying that this is why they wanted laws against tarot. It wasn't just tarot. These were also against other playing card games. So our standard poker decks that we have today, they had the same complaints about them when they came out, and they came out just a little bit before tarot cards did. It wasn't about anything esoteric or demonic, because tarot wasn't esoteric or demonic originally. It didn't have anything to do with those things. The issue was about maintaining social order and productivity. And so the origin of the church being against tarot was way before tarot was used for divination or fortune telling. It's just something that the church always spoke against and continued to do so, and the shape of speaking against it has just changed over time. Tarot cards were originally designed by Christians. The first people to give them esoteric meaning and publicly claim they could be used for cartomancy, or for reading the future by cards, were Christians. Most of them attached Christian meanings to the cards. In fact, the decks we have today, the early esoteric decks, had some different cards in them, and some of them were specifically in reference to elements of Christianity. Some people would also attach Jewish meanings to the cards, but mostly these Jewish meanings were based on Christian Kabbalah rather than ideas based on actual Judaism. So esoteric tarot is Christian in origin, and it's like heavily Christian in origin. The idea of it being associated with paganism and witchcraft really doesn't get going until those movements start in the 1950s. So it's a really new association. Now, if we're talking things like witchcraft and Ouija boards and whether or not those draw demons into you, the history isn't as obviously rooted in Christianity. But for tarot, it is. So now let's consider the important part. What's going on with tarot and with witchcraft from a practical perspective? So what are you actually doing, and does what you're doing open a door for demons? Do we see people plagued by demons by doing this? So tarot can be read in a few ways. You can look at images and read what random chance is telling you through those images. So the images can tell a story. There doesn't have to be anything beyond that. You can look at it as just randomly what's coming out and what story is laid out in these images and what they tell you about what it is that you're trying to figure out. You can use tarot as inspiration for your own internal intuition. So you look at the images, you relax, you reflect on them, and you see what comes to mind, what you're inspired to think, what your internal voice tells you. And so that's all about you. You can connect with the presence or the aura of another person or of a situation, and try to use the cards to guide and reflect what your intuition tells you about that connection. So sort of reading a vibe, like looking at what you feel, what comes into you when you try to open yourself up to this other person, or open yourself up to grasping this situation that you're trying to read about. And then the cards kind of guide how you read the feelings that you have from that. Again, that's really dealing with what's inside of you. So going back to that idea that started this, that's inside you, these forms of readings are about what's inside you, but it's not about gods or devils or heavens or hells being inside you. It's your own intuition, your own inner voice, your own ability to feel and know and interpret things that's inside you. So in none of those cases are spirits involved. So if you're reading those ways, which is the way a lot of people read, how would that invite in demons? It just doesn't make sense. It's just not a reasonable claim. Now, you can step it up, and I do recommend that you step it up at some point. You can use tarot to talk to spirits. You might call on your ancestors or your guardian angel, spirit guides or patron spirits, gods, angels, or even demons, and any of them could speak to you through the tarot. But if you're using tarot this way, you're calling on specific powers to speak through it. If you're doing this, you've learned how to call upon them. You've learned how to recognize them. And you should have spirits who guide and protect you and help make sure the right spirits are coming through. You should also have protective elements in place as part of your process for reading if you're reading this way. And I think you're going to get a lot more effective, a lot more interesting experiences reading this way. And so, again, this should be something that becomes a goal if it's not what you're doing initially. But it's not randomly inviting demons in. You are specifically calling in the specific spirits that you want to work with. They're not necessarily coming into your body, they are not invading your soul. They're just present, interacting with the cards, and speaking to you. And you're using the cards to help interpret what you are hearing from them. And this is something that can be done with any form of divination. And remember, divination really means getting information from gods or from spirits. It's not just any random fortune telling by the chance layout of things. It's the idea that these spiritual beings are guiding the layout of things in order to speak with you. You don't have to use divination tools that way. You can use divination tools just using random chance and using your own intuition. And that's going to be the difference. But whether you're doing it with spirits or not, it doesn't have to be an open call for any spirit to come in. And if it's not an open call for any spirit to come in, no demons are being invited in. And if you are calling on a demon, it's a demon where you've got controls, you've got protections, and they're not necessarily being invited into you. They're just being invited into the space, and then you're going to send them away. If that sounds too scary, you don't ever have to do that. You could call on angels, you can call on your guardian angel, you can call on your ancestors, you can call on God, you can call on Jesus, you can call on Mary or the saints. It's up to you. It's your comfort level. It's who you want to work with, and you define who you want to work with. And even if a spirit shows up and says they want to work with you and you aren't comfortable, you can say no. You don't have to just because they show up. Nothing is just automatically inviting them in. Now, we could get into issues of possession and things that do that, but that's usually going to involve more trauma. It's going to involve things that are weakening you, things that are messing you up, not things that are elevating you or empowering you or making you feel like you have more tools and options. Those things give you resilience, and resilience is something that makes it a lot harder for something to come in and try to take control of you and try to manipulate you. So if tarot is something that makes you feel more resilient, if it makes you feel more good, more empowered, it is something that is quite potentially protecting you from being in a state where you're more at risk. Now, if we're talking about witchcraft, and again, like, we can't look at the history of witchcraft and say, like, oh, this was a super Christian thing, even though for hundreds of years most witches were people who would have identified as Christians. We can't look at it and say, oh, there were never any demons involved in witchcraft, because there were sometimes. There were also fairies, there were also dead people, there were lots of types of spirits involved in witchcraft. But witchcraft doesn't seem to have a big history of the people doing it being possessed or being not in control of what they were doing. And a lot of witchcraft today has very little to do with that historical witchcraft anyway. So let's think about it from a today perspective. If we look at most witch forums, with the exception of Lilith, who people have kind of re-rendered as a goddess and have ignored most of her mythology and her history, almost no one is talking about demons. You'll get a lot of people who don't even work with gods, and some people who even work with the Christian God or with Jesus or angels or saints. There's a lot of variety, but none of it is a free-for-all in which the moment you cast a spell, the doors are swung open and legion fills you like a herd of swine. There are many, many people you can look at in witchcraft these days, and none of them are possessed. Many are happy, functional people who have the same problems people in mainstream religions have. So there's nothing there that is showing evidence that just because people get involved in witchcraft, they've invited in demons or they're plagued by demons. There's no evidence supporting that idea. Now, some church people will say if you work with gods or fairies or nature spirits, then those are demons in disguise. But those church people don't have any experience of those beings, so they don't know. Again, it is in their interest to lie to you and to tell you that. You can judge for yourself if those spirits truly seem like harmful demons in disguise or if they seem like what they are. God, the devil, the heavens and hells don't need to be in you. Common sense, confidence, discernment, and the ability to carefully explore and assess the world around you is what's inside you. And that's what you need in order to avoid problems. So trust what you do have inside you. Don't worry about making up claims to shrink reality so it can feel comfortable. You have the qualities needed to keep yourself safe and comfortable as you explore. Remember to use that discernment, and not just with spirits, but also with people. Whether it's me, or some crazy vitriolic pastor, or some witch talk influencer, discernment is your friend.